Hey guys, this is Josh here with Trillium Wild Edibles, and today I want to bring you guys a book review of the Edible Wild Plants, Wild Foods from Dirt to Plate by Dr. John Kallas. This is an amazing book on the subject of wild edible plants. This book is really in-depth. It's actually quite a bit more in-depth than most of the other books on the subject that I've found. As you can see here, it's got some really good pictures. It's got a lot of text. Give you guys a quick little preview here. It's a really thick book. This book covers about 15 different plants. Now that may not sound like it's a lot of plants, and it's really not. But the most important thing to keep in mind is the depth of which this book goes into. This book goes so far in depth that by the time you're done reading this book, the plants that it does cover, you're going to be using them like your professional cook. Alright, and one of my favorite things about this book is he actually goes through the entire life cycle of the plant, or what he calls the life story of the plant. This is really nice that he does this, the reason being, because if you're new to foraging or if you're new to any one of these plants, you're going to see what they look like at the very young stages, through the middle stages, all the way to the very end. And that's extremely important for being able to identify and enjoy these foods, or enjoy these plants as foods. Here in the first part of this book, he talks about how to learn the most from this book. He talks a little bit about how to use it, his inspiration behind writing this book. He also gives you a couple different pictures here that you can see that plant forms change over time, and sometimes they're just different forms altogether. Sometimes a plant can have several variations, and that's one of the things that he's kind of showing you here. Another thing that he talks about in this part of the book is what books on the subject, and this book also, means by properly prepared, or by gathered at the appropriate stage of growth. He kind of explains in depth a little bit what those mean here. But you can see here that he also gives a couple pictures to kind of back up what he's saying. And here's some mature milkweed pods, and here are some young pokeweed shoots. And these two plant parts are completely edible. Pokeweed shoots are edible in this stage. This is normally when people are gathering them. The milkweed pods aren't edible in this stage. So that's kind of important to keep in mind. And that's something that he's telling you a little bit here. Another thing this author talks about throughout the book on every single plant is their end size. This is extremely important to keep in mind, and this is something that I had no idea about, or I didn't really even think about whenever I first started foraging. And I'm really glad this author goes into this, because nobody else that I know of really goes into it in the depth that he does. Now there may be some books that do, I just haven't read them yet. But he kind of goes through and explains a little bit about end size on leaves and stems and various plant parts, and how they can affect the palatability, or how they can affect the texture or taste of different plants. He kind of goes through it on each plant, and he explains rapid growth and factors that affect rapid growth, like growing conditions, germination time. And you see, these are really important as well, because sometimes the growing conditions combined with the end size of the plant that you're harvesting is going to affect the taste or the palatability of what it is that you're actually consuming. One thing I really like about this book as well is these really nice pictures. You can see that these pictures are extremely in-depth. They're great high-definition photographs. They're up close, they're personal, they show all of the detail of the plant that you need to know. I chose this plant because it's really unique. The uses that the author gives are really unique. He does a really good way of laying them out, and he also goes into extreme detail in the process. So I wanted to use mallow as an example of the detail that he goes into in this book. At the beginning section for each plant, you'll get a couple pages of text explaining the history, the uses, information, maybe chemical information, nutritional information, maybe identification information, or just some kind of fun facts about the plant, just to kind of get you started on information on the plant. He also gives you the estimated range with the official species name. He gives you different synonyms like historical names. He also gives you the common names of the plant as well. He also gives you a little bit of fun facts or a little information, like there are a couple different mallow plants that you may actually come across. And they look similar, and their uses are the same for food. However, they may not be covered in the book that you have, so he kind of explains that here, which is pretty cool. After you get your introductory information with each plant, he's going to go in and explain the growth cycle of each one, or the life story of each plant. And you can see here I was showing you the sprouts and what they look like at a very early stage, and what they look like a little bit older, and what they look like when they get a little bit older. And he goes through all the way through this plant's life cycle. He does this with each plant. Here's a really good close-up of the flower of mallow. He gives you plenty of text explaining the look of the sprouts with, of course, pictures to back that up. He goes in and explains the leaves, he explains the flowers, the fruits, and then after he goes through and explains some of the identification factors of each part of the plant with pictures, he goes through and then he explains how to harvest and use them properly, which is extremely awesome. Here you can see the picture of that turkey sandwich again. This is using mallow leaves. Looks like it has a garnish of wood sorrel flowers on top of it. At the very end of each section on each plant, you're also going to get a couple of recipes. And these recipes are going to cover a wide variety of uses. Like here he starts off with shrimp mumbo gumbo sauce. Then he goes into a chicken mumbo gumbo soup, which is using mallow, which is really, really cool. This is something that you may not think of to do with a plant that's growing in your yard that you thought was just a weed. This is the kind of depth that the author goes into. He goes to explain mallow confections. And here he's showing the very beginning stages of making mallow white or mallow foam, which can be used to make like mallow whipped cream or mallow meringue. He even gives you a recipe for a huckleberry mallow meringue pie. Here he's talking about the mallow, and he gives really good in-depth information, and he also explains that it's similar to a Kraft Jet Puffed marshmallow. His information is so in-depth that after reading this once or twice, I felt like I could go out in my yard and grab them and do it without even reading it from the book. So I was really, really pleased with the depth of information that he went into and how well he actually laid all of this stuff out. He lays this stuff out so well and so plain that it's easy for the average person to just pick this book up, read it, and understand exactly what he's saying. Here you can see the very end result of the mallow making process. So this is the kind of depth that this author goes into. So after you read this book, and after you read something on one of these plants, you're going to be able to use it in pretty much anything that you can think of in your normal diet. There's no reason why you shouldn't be able to. This book gives you that kind of information. I know a lot of people may be wanting it. This book has it. Another thing I really like about this book is he also goes in to explain a little bit about bitter greens. Now most people, whenever they first forage for the first time, one of the first things they usually eat is clovers or dandelion greens or something of that sort. And usually a lot of wild greens that you're going to be consuming are going to be either bitter or pungent or sour or something along those lines. And in some cases and some times of the year, depending on what condition they're at, where they're growing, which he explains in this book, that's going to affect sometimes how bitter the plant actually is. Now here, before he actually gets into some of the bitter plants in this book that he talks about, he explains a little bit about understanding why the plants are bitter. And he also explains how to manage the bitterness in these fresh greens, and also how to manage the bitterness in cooking the fresh greens, which is really, really nice of him to lay all this out. It's also really, really nice of him to just go ahead and explain all of this to you in such a way that makes so much sense that whenever you go out in your yard and you gather dandelion leaves, you're no longer going to be picking the bitter, nasty ones that you don't really want to eat a whole lot of. So that's something I've ran across with a lot of people. They eat dandelion once or twice, they never get it to taste right, and they don't know why. He explains that very, very well in this book. Another thing he also does in some cases is he gives you a good comparison photographs between some plants. Like this is a comparison photograph between dandelion, chicory, and cat's ear leaf, which is really important information to know. Not that any one of these are actually toxic, it's just a matter of fact, maybe you're not wanting chicory, maybe you're wanting dandelion, maybe you're wanting cat's ear. So this is kind of important, and this is the detail that he goes into in his pictures as well. In the very, very back of this book, he goes and talks about the potential of wild foods. This part of the book is extremely interesting, and in my opinion, it's one of my favorite parts of the book. And the reason it's one of my favorite parts of the book is because he goes and explains a little bit about why wild foods are good for you and your family, how they can be a great social activity, how they can help treat nature deficit disorder, and help get your kids away from their Xboxes and their PlayStations and such. He also talks about the nutrition of wild foods, which is really interesting because this author is actually a certified nutritionist. He's also a doctor, so this is really, really good book. This guy has an extremely large list of credentials. He talks a little bit about the nutrients in wild foods and how there are some common misconceptions between domesticated and wild foods. Like, are wild foods more nutritious or healthier than domesticated foods? And what nutrients do wild foods even have to offer? Some people think they might not even have anything to offer, which is actually kind of surprising because here in the back of the book, a little bit further back, and here in the back of the book, he gives you a nutrient chart of a lot of the greens that are in this book. A couple of them aren't listed, however, almost all of them are. What's really awesome is he also gives you a nutrient values in 100 grams of common domesticated greens, like mustard greens, collard greens, kale, broccoli, or spinach, which is really, really cool of him to do, so you can kind of compare the nutrient values between some of the wild greens and some of these domesticated greens. And whenever you do, you're going to be extremely surprised at the differences. Another thing he also does in the back of the book, which is really nice, is he talks about a little bit about crafting a wild paradise. Like growing your old wild garden or utilizing wild plants in your garden. And here's a picture of a tomato plant that he's got growing with, I believe, probably some chickweed or something of the sort, kind of as a ground mulch or a green growing mulch around to help retain moisture inside of the soil. So that's really cool that he does this, and it kind of gives you some good ideas on utilizing wild plants in your own yard without really having to do a lot of work, which will provide you with some extra food. So I thank you guys for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you learned something. If you want to learn more about wild, edible, or medicinal plants, make sure to subscribe.